Yeah, I'd say pretty wild 3 days. Exciting, culmination of a lot of work and a lot of effort by a lot of people. Just can't say enough about the work that I would say our team has done organizationally, just from the different areas, the different departments. From scouting, it's not just scouting, it's medical, it's data technology, it's all the areas of the building that support one another, working in unison. And I think the draft is no better example of that, for the amount of things that take place and happen over the course of 3 days. I'd say at a pretty rapid pace and speed. You have to have a lot of really good people around you that you can count on and depend on. And I'd say, like, personally, I'm certainly thankful and grateful for those people, because without them, none of this would be possible. So, as we've talked about over the last few days, I think we're making some progress with the team, continue to build the team here for the 2022 season. I'd say there's definitely work in front of us. I'm sure there'll be some transactions that take place, once the draft is over, once the weekend is over, all throughout the spring, leading to training camp and all the way up until the start of the season, and whatever day that we play, whenever the schedule does come out. So, I think this is a culmination, specifically the draft, of, I'd say, year-round process, year-long work from a lot of people. It's 3 days, but it's more than 3 days. I'd say it's pretty comprehensive, it's pretty detailed, and the investment of energy, time that our people, specifically the scouting staff, put into this, and then to see the excitement and joy on their faces and the conviction that they have in players when you have a discussion with them. I mean, that's what it's all about. So, and my job is to synthesize all the information, process it, and just try to make the right decision for the organization. And, hopefully we've done that here over the weekend. So specific to today, went into the day, I want to say, with 5 picks. I think we had the third, the 2 fifths, the 2 sixes to start. So we had the second pick there early on. I'd say, one of the things that's probably a little bit different this year than most years is typically, those first, I would say, 8 to 10 picks, you'll see a decent amount of movement. Teams want to come up. I think one of the things this year, some of the teams behind us had multiple fourth-round picks, so they didn't feel maybe inclined to move to get a particular player, who's kind of sit and pick or just kind of maneuver around, position around. So we had some discussions and dialogue with some teams around us, but nothing substantive. And ultimately, as we've always talked about with our staff, we always have to be prepared to pick. So kind of went through our process last night into this morning about the group of players that we'd have to choose from or pick from. Had a real good dialogue and exercise with everybody, and then ultimately decided the pick with Damien, running back from Florida. I'd say, those of you that spoke to him on the Zoom, I'd say his energy is, and that's who he is. I mean, he plays with a lot of joy, he plays a lot of fight, he plays a lot of toughness, and his personality, I would say, transfers over to the football field. So kind of played a little bit of rotation down there at Florida this year, so they had him and another back they rotated in. Like, what's the reason? I mean, again, that's up to the coaching staff for them to determine how they want to deploy their players. But, I mean, talking about a guy that's 5'9", 217 pounds, that's built, strong, low to the ground, has good contact balance, good lower body strength, good lateral quickness, maybe lacks a little bit of top-end speed, and has decent hands. And I would say his mindset and skill set potentially projects to a role in the kicking game. So we talked about a player trying to create multiple roles for themselves on a roster. So I'd say in Damien's situation, I think he'll have an opportunity. I mean, I don't think this is going to be all about offense and who's going to carry the ball and he's going to be a lead runner. I think that's a bunch of BS. I think he's got to earn his opportunity on the team and, hopefully create a role for himself. And I think his ability to potentially play on 4 downs is probably what's more important than any particular thing about, how many yards he's going to run for in early downs. I mean, we have a lot of good backs in this building, and I'd say he's a part of that group, but I wouldn't say he's any better than the guys that we have in the building. So we'll let the competition kind of play itself out and see what happens. So then we had the 2 fifth-round picks there. So there was quite a sizable gap from 107 to, 166 or 166 and 170, whatever it was. And we felt like we were going to probably lose a pretty significant amount of players. So the cost of moving, up a few spots to pick Booker, we just thought it made sense. We just don't want to put ourselves in a position where we're just kind of holding on picks, kind of holding on to your ass and hoping that a player's going to be there. So just felt it could scoot a little bit, and move. I think Booker was the next pick, right? Yeah, I think we traded up to get Booker, a few spots. So I'd say, with Booker, his system, I'd say a little bit more of a, not a 3-man front, but kind of odd space front. He kind of projects a little bit more kind of to defensive tackle in our front, kind of, potentially both 1 technique to 3 technique, but, 6'3", 310 pounds, ran sub-5 flat or right around there. So, runs well, is smart, good lateral quickness, a player that we visited. I mean, he, a lot of quality, I would say, things going for him. Obviously went to Stanford, so he's smarter than, probably half of our team. So maybe him and Davis can compete to see who's the smartest guy on the team. But, smart, productive player. I'd say his skill set and playing style kind of fits some of the things that we're doing defensively. So, excited to add him to the to the group. So then we picked Thomas, and then take Booker, and then Teagan was the next pick. Teagan was actually a guy we were kind of talking about kind of throughout the day. I think the offensive staff, that was kind of, I would say, their equivalent of the Christian Harris pick last night. So they were really excited when we picked him. He's a 6'5", 265 pounds, on line of scrimmage tight end who plays tough, he plays strong, he plays physical. And I think the tight ends are going to be a part of the offense here in this season, whether it's 2 tight ends, 1 tight end, 3 tight ends, however we do it. He was a player that there was definitely a lot of conviction for what potentially he could bring to the table, kind of meat and potatoes. He's not going to, let's say, run past a lot of people down the field in the passing game, but he plays strong, he plays physical, he plays with tenacity. He plays, and hopefully will give us a presence at the end of the line of scrimmage, similar to guys like Farrow, similar to players like Anthony. That was, I would say, the thought process, behind that pick there. And then going back to a little bit earlier for the Booker pick, we took one of the 6s we had and then used that as a part of the trade to go up. And then one of the things that we had actually talked about, we had the 2 6s going in, and depending on how it went, if we were to just sit at 205 and 207, maybe taking one of those 6 and pushing it to the 7th, kind of 2 for 1. So we just said, all right, well, let's just move the 6 to the as a part of the trade for Booker, and then we had 205 left, or whichever one we didn't trade. And then we had some discussions actually about going 2 for 1. So do we 2 for 1 the 6th for 2 7ths and maybe hope we get a group of players, or why don't we just go ahead and pick a player who we think we like, we have some conviction behind. I think he's a player that we were interested in regardless. So instead of waiting, and I think, come to find out, if we didn't pick him where we did, Austin, we probably would have lost, I don't know, just about every other player by the time we got to those 7th-round picks that were even thinking about moving. And I would say in the end, the teams that were even interested in doing that never came to fruition. They kind of bowed out and dropped out. So kind of the same thing. All right, here are our scenarios. If we pick, here's what we're going to pick. If we move, here are our options. So we just said we're going to sit and pick, and we picked Austin. One of the few players that, I'd say Cal McNair has a lot in common with, since they went to the same high school. So I think that was a pretty funny moment on a call when they kind of shared that little tidbit. So I think he's a little bit better player than Cal was. No offense. I'm sure Cal crushed me for that, but I think that's okay. But, talking about a guy that's a 4-year starter in the SEC and played, 50-some-odd games, whatever the heck it was. So pretty consistent player, 6'5", 310 pounds, got 34-inch arms. Runs 5 flat, which I'd say for an offensive lineman, that's pretty good. Played mostly on the right side of during his career, so whether or not he could kind of flip and play, both sides, we'll see. So once we finished picking there with Austin, then kind of sort of working through the post-draft free agency process. So I'd say we'll probably end up with, 10 to 12 of those guys. I don't think anything's really done. I'm sure there's some names floating out there, but I wouldn't put a lot of stock in it just yet. So I think we still got a lot of work to do here on that. But, we'll probably add 10 to 12 more players and then kind of look at where we are over the weekend, evaluate the team, and then make some decisions moving forward. But, again, I think this weekend is as much about the players. It's about the players, but I'd say it's much about the organization and the people that are involved in this process as anything else. So, without them, I certainly wouldn't be able to do my job. So. So with that, we'll open it up to some questions. Yeah, I don't think we need a microphone. I think we'll be all right. Oh, they need it for the audio. Sorry. That's why I don't work in audio visual.
Generally speaking, you went in with a list of priorities. How do you feel like you checked those boxes?
Yeah, it's not, if we got to pick this position, pick this player. I don't think it's that. It's, all right, what are our options? Who do we feel are good football players? How do we think they might be able to project onto our football team? Because you don't guarantee that you're actually going to, even if you said, okay, here are the priorities, we're going to do this, and if for whatever reason it doesn't work out, then you shift your priorities. So I think the consistent theme is pick good players, be committed to our process, and then just try to make the right decision at the time when we have the opportunity to pick. So I think that's really the approach. It's not about, I'd say some of this is coincidental to, picking a bunch of players from Houston. I mean, it's great, but, just not just because they're from Houston. It's because they're good players. Look, I would say this, like, there's a lot of good football players in the state of Texas and specifically in the city of Houston. So, I mean, it's probably a good place to start. So, the fact that they're homegrown here is probably more, their families are probably more ecstatic than I would say anybody else. So I'd say some of that's kind of coincidental more than anything else. So, hopefully we've accomplished a few things. We've added good players to our team who are good peoples that we think are going to help build our program or continue to build our program out. I mean, I think that's really the priority and the focus.
You talked a little bit about Pierce, but what do you think you can do to a team having a guy with that kind of attitude, and he plays seemingly with the same kind of intensity and excitement as he acts? So how can that help, especially a young team trying to build a culture that you keep talking about?
Yeah, football is a mindset. Football is a tough-ass game that requires mental toughness, physical toughness, and competitive stamina. Like, that's what football demands. And so, and you have to have the requisite physical skills along with those types of qualities. So the more players you have like that on your team, when you turn to either side of you and you see that's the mindset and that's the mentality and that's the work ethic, like, you don't have a choice, because if you don't do that, like, you're going to stand out like a sore thumb. So, and I would say specific to running backs, this is more of a general statement. When you have players like that carry the ball, whether it's Burkhead, whether it's, Damien, I would say Marlin, like, offensive linemen want to block for people that have that mentality, and we talk about straining, we talk about finishing and getting the extra yard. And when you see a player that does everything he can to try to gain extra yards, it says, I'm trying to do everything I can to help this team gain basically another yard, another inch. So you add up the inches, you add up the yards, that can maybe make the difference, in a score at the end of the game. So, I mean, I think one of the highlights they showed, the guy's helmet was ripped off, but, he kept running. So, he doesn't care about, his physical well-being. He's just trying to be a football player. So I'd say the one thing that's probably pretty consistent with the players that we've drafted is that mindset. Whether it's Jalen, whether it's John Mechie, whether it's Damien Pierce, I would put Deculus in that category. You go on down the line, I think they share that and they see that in their teammate, and they're going, all right, this is how we need to play. Kenyon, big-ass, physical offensive lineman that moves people. Okay, so, you want to be a tough team, you want to be a physical team, you better have tough physical players that adopt that mindset, and then they'll see what happens when we get on the field.
You talked a little bit about the undrafted process. What is your mindset going into that? How do you kind of set that up so you're ready to make those offers when the draft ends? Yeah,
it's a great question. Honestly, we probably spend as much time on that area, Sarah, as any others. So you have an idea of some players that you've earmarked, and you want to be realistic too. Well, we'd like to sign this guy after the draft. Well, if he's going to get drafted in the 5th round, then we're kind of wasting our time. So you kind of fill that out as you're working through the process, and you earmark certain players, and maybe there's some players that you say, wow, the fact that he didn't get drafted, then we'll start with that. So you might have to shift your gears a little bit or shift your priorities, but I would say the same thought process and mindset in those players, it permeates that process just like it does the players that are drafted. So I think our scouts specifically take a lot of pride probably in that group more than anything else, because you're finding players even though they weren't drafted, but they still have the opportunity to make your football team. And I'd say that's as in-depth a process as probably any others. So it's exciting, and it moves pretty quickly. You're going to lose players. You think you have a player, okay, you got to wait till the end of the draft, see what happens, then he gets drafted, and then you got to go to the next player. Oh, well, not sure if you can get him. So, like everything, you just have to be flexible. You got to be ready to pivot. You got to be able to duck and move a little bit. And then, when it's time to make a decision and make a commitment to somebody, make that commitment. And as long as they reciprocate on their end, then we have an agreement, and then we can move on.
How many players at each position you want to add or anything like that?
It's not, I would say, specific to position, because even there's a player maybe at a position where you maybe have enough bodies or enough players, but if you think he's a good player, you add him to the mix. Or even if you maybe have players on your team, you might say, if we add this player, we can offset that or move on from said player. So you kind of look at where are your numbers. Like, we have an idea going in the camp. Let's call it, 88 to 90 players. So there's going to be, let's call it roughly, 43 on offense, 43 on defense, 3 specialists. So in each position is going to have certain numbers associated with that. So if you have, fill some of those slots and fill some of those numbers just for practice purposes, but you still just don't want to fill them with, a bunch of guys like me and Mark. You want to fill them with, good football players. Sorry, Mark. So, but I would say, we're pretty purposeful, with that group as well. So glad everybody can get a joke and smile in here. It's okay. Sorry, Mark.
Right. With Booker, with that pick, you say is more on the interior. Where do you see in football, just like, how maybe there's more pressure in the backfield coming from interior guys than maybe before?
It's a combination of, if you have good edge rushers, you can create pressure on the edge. I would say a lot of teams, try to pressure the interior of the pocket. So whether it's with four-man front, whether it's odd space front, whether they put the linebackers in the A-gaps, I would say Miami's as good of a team probably, when you watch the way that they pick stun inside. So you're using a linebacker, you're trying to create a pick stun between either the zero technique or the three technique. So the quickest path to the quarterback is inside the pocket. So on the perimeter of the pocket, if the end beats the tackle off the snap, then obviously he can get there. But the tackle, if he can at least get in the way and cut off the junction point, and then wherever the launch point is for the quarterback, you're trying to force that player around it. Okay, so try to protect. Your mindset in pass protection is inside out. Okay, so where does protection start? It starts inside. Inside out, if you get inside, the quickest path to the quarterback is from point A to point B, right down the middle. So if you have a good pass rusher, it doesn't mean you can eliminate them. It's not saying that, but they have to take a little bit more of a circuitous route to the quarterback, and you have a tackle that can at least force it outside, which is you see a lot of ends. They start to the outside shoulder of the tackle, and if the tackle oversets them, they end up back inside. So the notion of creating pressure on the inside part of the pocket, I would say just to get the quarterback off the launch point, I would say that's a factor for every team. Now, if you have a mobile quarterback and you force a guy off the spot, you got to make sure that you have contain and some kind of presence on the outside of the formation. So however you create pressure, you're going to create pressure. You're going to create it with four-man front. You're going to create a three-man front. You're going to create an odd space front with two linebackers in the A-gaps. Or, you're going to put five down in the line of scrimmage, play a diamond. So how do you create pressure on a quarterback? You need good players, but there's a schematic element that's involved as well.
Obviously, you had more picks this year than last. How much more is it easier? Do you feel like there's more things you can do to trade down and use those? How much I don't know, how much more effective was, some of your strategies that you normally do this year than
you just have more opportunities. So it just gives you a little more flexibility to maybe kind of move up and down a little bit. Some teams I'd say are more willing than others to move up and down. Some teams just want to move back. Some teams just want to sit and pick. So the more resources you have at your disposal, it just gives you more flexibility to kind of, use the assets accordingly.
Nick, when you look at the whole draft class as a whole, 6 players from the SEC, going through the evaluation process, are you noticing something different between these players? Are they more NFL ready? Maybe they fit the system? What goes into that process of maybe seeing how many players from one certain conference?
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit last night. SEC, seem against good teams, but good football players are good football players. So whether they play in the SEC, whether they play in the ACC, whether they play in the Pac-12, whether they play in a Colonial, whether they play in the AAC, a good football player is a good football player. I think one thing that you have to be conscious of is evaluating that player and the competition that he's playing against. That's a fair part of the evaluation. You can't totally discard that. So it's a part of it. Then you actually have to look at the player. Do the skills that he shows, regardless of level of competition, are those going to transfer over into our level? So you kind of have some ideas. Some players are able to make that transition better than others. But the reality is, okay, the SEC, their careers are over. Nobody cares about what they did now at LSU, Florida, wherever the hell they played. What people care about is what are you going to do when you're a Houston Texan. So what are you going to do with your opportunities? You're going to make the most of your opportunities. We're trying to create as much competition in here as possible, bring in good players, and the players are ultimately going to determine how big of a role they have on the team. We're not going to predetermine it. It doesn't matter what round he was drafted in. In the end, you have to produce, you have to perform. If you do that, you're going to play. If you don't, somebody else is going to play. It's very simple.
Nick, going into this draft, do you feel like there was a sense of urgency to try to hit on every single one of these picks, especially considering last year you guys found some really good players given the small draft capital that you guys had?
Yeah, we're not going to know if we quote-unquote hit on these picks for a couple of years. So, look, the draft grades are meaningless. Whatever the big draft grades are tomorrow, okay, this team got an A, this guy got a B, based on what? Through what lens? These guys haven't played one snap of football. So our urgency is there every day. Like as we build a team, our urgency to get good players on the team, whether it's a guy that we draft, it's a guy that we work out as a free agent, it's a guy that we sign as a free agent, it's guys we trade for. There's urgency every day. There's urgency in the NFL. So I'd say there's no additional pressure to quote unquote hit on our picks. I don't even know what that means. Like ultimately, the player's performance is going to dictate whether or not like he's a good player, he's not a good player. If it doesn't work out, okay, we'll move on from that player and we'll go find somebody else. Like that's our job, and that mindset and that thought process is going to permeate our building for as long as I'm in charge.
Nick, with your former employer, you helped build a dynasty. How much of that of that experience that you use going into this draft and evaluating the players this time around?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say very much. I'd say more than anything, like my training is my training. So, I mean, I wasn't I was a small part of, the players ultimately are determined how successful an organization is. So what we try to do is try to put a good plan in place, try to have a good process, be very thoughtful and purposeful. And I would say just stay consistent and disciplined to the things that you believe in and that you think go into putting a good team together. I think that's probably where I was most fortunate, is to see how we put the team together, and it's about the players. The most important thing is about the players and how they play, and ultimately they're the ones that are going to put the banners up there. It's not going to be me. So, those 20 years of experience, I would say, were invaluable just from a teaching and learning standpoint, and how we apply, their principles and things that we're going to try to apply. But you don't just drop one program into a new building and say, like, here it is. Well, it's going to work because this is what we did there. I think you take the things that you learn. I think just more than anything, the thought process, that goes into the why. And I would say one thing that probably Bill doesn't get enough credit for is his ability to just continually pivot and adjust and stay ahead, and not just kind of follow the curve and not just do things because it worked, 6 or however many times it worked. So I think you got to be humble. It's a humbling sport. It's a humbling game. And just when you think you have it all figured out, you get smacked in the face. So I think, look, the reality is it's a great weekend for the organization. We're all excited. We're excited for the players that we brought in the building. Hopefully our team is excited. But the reality is there's a lot of work, and it's going to be about how hard we work, how well we work, and what we do when we're ultimately on the field. All right.
Everybody good? Mark, you want one more?
Yeah, go ahead, Mark. Sure.
Just as far as your group of undrafted free agents, is it more important for you to add a quarterback in that group?
If we feel it's something that makes sense, we'll look at. I think the 3 players that we have at that position right now, like, we feel good about working with them. But like any position, Mark, if there's a player that we feel makes sense to add to the mix, we'll certainly consider it. If it doesn't really fit or make sense, then we won't. So always be open-minded, never going to pigeonhole ourselves, and just always be just alert for opportunities that we think make some sense. You bet. Absolutely. Thanks, guys. Yep.